Welcome on behalf of the Newark Public Library. I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's program, The City and the Show, Newark's Vibrant Theater Row, 1895 through 1935, with cultural historian and activist Michael Immerso. We are pleased to co-sponsor yet another event with the Newark History. We are pleased to be co-sponsoring this Newark History Society program with our amazing community partners at NJPAC. And of course, we are always excited to shed light and learn more about this city's rich, vibrant history. We ask that our audience hold their questions until after our speaker's presentation. There will be plenty of time following for questions. I'll bring the mic around for our guests here in the space. And for anybody who may be watching on Zoom or whatever platform you're on, please enter comments in the chat and we'll have someone there monitoring and hopefully get space for all of your questions this evening. So I want to thank you all again. And it is my pleasure to introduce from NJPAC, the great Aisha Marable. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. You can do better than that. Good evening, everyone. I'm excited about this wonderful gathering. This is our first for the season. Can we celebrate Newark History Society and our Tim Chris? Yes? Okay. You're not as excited as I am. That's okay. You will be by the end of the evening because we have an amazing agenda. We have a wonderful program. We just know that this is an exciting topic. If you love history, if you love art, if you love culture, if you love Newark, you are in for a great treat tonight. And so we're excited that not only is NJPAC in the community because of the history, the rich culture, but our partnerships are so valuable to us. So we just appreciate you, Newark Public Library, all that are here, and those, raise your hand if you are a member of Newark History Society. We appreciate you. You are all our partners. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome our presenter, Michael Immerso, a writer, a cultural historian and collectivist who will discuss the city's vibrant theater district. In other words, how Buster Keaton, Fred Astaire, Charlie Chaplin, and quite a few others actually ended up here and came through this city. The series is only possible because of this collaboration that we have. And so we're so excited that you're here to infuse the energy. We look forward to more, so mark your calendars or take out your digital calendars and place in there. Remember that we have coming up very soon on November 12th, From Newark's Little Italy to Capitol, The Life of Peter Rodino. Who will come to see that? Yes, I'm excited. Start RSVPing early. We want to make sure that you are here for that and tell your friends to come as well. And we'll keep you busy this fall. We are partnering with Newark Arts Festival. So we're having programs here and we're partnering with Newark Museum. Lots going on in the Newark area. So please come out, come out, come out. Our Hispanic Heritage program will be taking place on Sunday, October 13th. So if you want some arts education about I think it's 7 different countries, right? We will be talking about it, dancing about it, eating about these particular areas. Without further ado, I turn the program over to our fearless leader, Tim Chris.
Thanks, Aisha. This is the 23rd year of programs for the Newark History Society, and I think a number of you have been with us from the very beginning. Certainly the Newark Public Library has as a partner, and over the last 10 years, NJPAC. And it is really wonderful to see these different groups and institutions in Newark come together to support this effort to learn more about our history as a city and those who've lived here. I'm Tim Christ. I'm president of the Newark History Society. I am really pleased not only do we have some folks who've been with us over the last 20 years, but we also have a class from Rutgers that Mark Krasovic has brought. He's teaching a class about Newark culture, Newark cultural history. Is that it? There you go. So it's great to have Mark's class with us here tonight from Rutgers. And we're especially pleased that Michael Immerso has made his way back to Newark, having been born here, but having lived in Massachusetts for a number of years now. He has certainly spoken to the Newark History Society before, but Michael's the real deal, as many of you know. Native Newarker, went to Rutgers Newark, was student body president, led a number of the anti-war demonstrations and advocated for autonomy for Rutgers Newark. Took that experience as an activist to work on nuclear weapons freeze testing, headed the New Jersey effort for that, took part in demonstrations around the world. But he also has this strong interest in cultural history. And he first turned to that with his study of Newark's Old First Ward. His book, I can look it up here. Newark's Little Italy, The Vanished First Ward. And I was happy to tell Michael that Philip Roth's copy is indeed in the Philip Roth Library around the corner there. And I asked the librarian there to look to see what Roth had written on the 10 sticky notes that he included in his copy of Michael's book as he read through it. Later, Michael did a study of Coney Island. He's written a couple novels, a theater play. I think you're even working on a book of poetry. But a recent passion has been to learn more about Newark's Theater Row about 100 years ago, in the first few decades of the 20th century. And that's what he's going to talk about tonight. As Reggie noted, we'll hope to have a Q&A session at the end, alternating a question from here. This is a hybrid program, so we have a number of people online as well. If those questions come into the chat, I will look at them and read them, and we'll go back and forth for as long as we have time. Michael, please welcome Michael Immerso.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I just want to acknowledge the wonderful help that I've gotten from the staff of the Newark Public Library, from the New Jersey Historical Society, and also does support from Tim Christ and the Newark History Society. I'm going to do the presentation in 2 parts, and in the middle, we'll look at some slides so that you don't have to keep looking at me and you'll see something else to focus on. I do want to add one thing before I start speaking. Part of the era that I'm going to be talking about is a period where racial stereotypes and ethnic stereotypes were quite common. And it's impossible to tell that story without discussing that. And that means using words that are now essentially considered either racist or stereotypical. But we really can't actually do a complete study of it or understand it without some of that. Why is this doing this? Let me know if this is not coming through. At the start of the 20th century, in urban centers throughout the United States, new forms of popular entertainment proliferated that were unique in character. Vaudeville, syncopated music and jazz, sound recordings and phonograph, moving pictures and Nickelodeon, Broadway musicals, and broadcast radio. It was the birth of what we consider mass popular culture in the United States. New York was the epicenter, but Newark, because of its proximity to New York, and because of the density of its population and sophistication, played an outsized role in this evolution. But Newark's closeness to New York was both a blessing and a curse to a certain extent, because Newark's contributions were most often overlooked. This makes it an ideal case study in examining the trajectory of popular culture in the United States and its birth in American cities. Newark's theaters were a proving ground for performers and shows bound for New York. It also played a prominent role in the emerging media that propelled America's popular culture. Celluloid film was invented here, and some of the earliest moving pictures and sound recordings were made within sight of the Four Corners. Moreover, Newark was a pioneer in radio, which disseminated the new cultural norms to an ever-expanding audience. Newark's show places were created by men who became leading figures in the theater and motion picture industry. F.F. Proctor opened his first Newark theater in 1902. Proctor was a vaudeville impresario with a chain of 50 theaters. Adolf Zucker and Marcus Lowe operated penny arcades in Market Street that became storefront motion picture houses. Lowe's became president of Lowe's Pictures, the parent company of MGM. Zucker founded the Paramount Pictures. William Fox purchased his first Nickelodeon in Newark in 1904 and built a chain of motion picture houses. In 1915, he formed Fox Film Corporation with financial support from investors, including Prudential Insurance Company. The company that Zucker founded was 20th Century Fox. Market Street bathed in light. Actually, I just take. The date was July 14th, 1909, when electrified arc lamps transformed Market Street into a river of light. 150,000 people were present that evening, but even greater numbers gathered at the Four Corners on election night and Halloween when crowds reached the 250,000. Newark had grown more diverse and cosmopolitan. Its workforce, men and women alike, craved amusement. They spent leisure time at venues scattered about the city, but the Four Corners was the city's beating heart. The nucleus of Newark's nascent amusement district was on Market Street between Halsey and Broad. This was a site of Library Hall where crowds were entertained by illusionists and human curiosities such as General Tom Thumb. It was where Alexander Victor opened one of the first movie theaters in America in 1897 and the site of the Atlantic Garden and the Newark Opera House. For a quarter of a century, the Newark Opera House was the city's leading showplace. It was eventually eclipsed by two other theaters, the Grand Opera House on Washington Street and the Park Theater on West Park Street, both managed by Leonard Gray, Newark's first theatrical impresario. In 1879, the Newark Opera House was acquired by Fred Waldman, who played a prominent part in the evolution of Newark's amusement district. Waldman owned beer gardens and variety houses and was the first to introduce vaudeville to Newark audiences. Waldman's Metropolitan Variety Theater, called the Atlantic Garden, was the largest in the city and could accommodate 2,000 patrons. The amount of business done at the Market Street Hall was astonishing, the Sunday Call reported. The demand for popular entertainment led to the opening of new theaters. Harry Miner's Newark Theater, erected on Market Street in 1886, was the city's first modern theater and became its most important showplace. In 1898, Fred Waldman Jr. built a vaudeville house on Washington Street that became the Empire Theater. Then in 1902, F.F. Proctor opened his palatial palace on Park Place. There is not in all America a handsomer theater than this, a reviewer wrote. Interest in refined vaudeville by Newark theatergoers proves that Proctor's fills a long felt want. Proctor's theater presented popular vaudeville acts. When the Three Keatons appeared in 1903, the Evening News wrote, "Joe, Myra, and Buster will be seen in their laughable acrobatic absurdity called The Man on the Table. Buster has a reputation of being the cleverest child comedian in vaudeville, and his past performances have been a source of merriment." One of Will Rogers' first stage appearances was at Proctor's in 1905. The Evening News called him a plainsman from the wild, woolly West, expert in throwing a lariat while mounted on a bronco. The show was headlined by actress Valerie Bergère in a one-act comedy and included Cooper and Robinson, described in the program as clever colored entertainers. The Robinson in the act was Bill Bojangles Robinson, who hadn't yet begun his solo career. Performers at Proctor's included Carnot's London Comedy Company. The troupe was the Monty Python of its period and introduced a style of pantomime that pushed boundaries. They first appeared at Proctor's in 1908 and returned in 1910 with a cast that included Charlie Chaplin and Stan Laurel. By then, Newark's commercial district was well delineated. Financial institutions were concentrated on the east side of Broad between Commerce and Market on what was called Finance Row. South of Market on the west side of Broad were the clothing establishments on Taylor's Row. On the north side of Market between Washington and Plain were the furniture outlets that comprised Furniture Row. Department stores, including Bamberger's and Haynes, were on Broad and Halsey between Market and Central Avenue. Newark's amusement district, its Theater Row, bisected the commercial rows and included parts of Market, Washington, Halsey, Branford Place, and a portion of Broad between the Four Corners and Hill Street. As the amusement district grew, new show places opened or replaced older ones. Miners Theater remained the primary venue for first-class dramas and musical productions. Vaudeville was the attraction at Proctor's. Other theaters had to adjust to changing tastes. The Grand Opera House became the Columbia Theater with a stock company that staged popular shows at reduced prices. Other houses featured melodramas that appealed to the public's appetite for cheap entertainment that mirrored the experience of working-class playgoers. Ticket prices were set at 10, 20, and 30 cents, and the shows were called 10, 20, 30 melodramas. Charles Blaney specialized in blood and thunder productions in his theater on Washington Street, which he promoted in bold headlines: the largest, handsomest, coziest, and popularest theater in Newark, the place where the business is being done. Fanny Bryce recalled trotting down to Washington Street to see the old Blood and Thunder shows. My favorite dodge, she wrote, was to sneak into Blaney's gallery while they were airing and cleaning the house in the morning between 9 o'clock and hide there until matinee time. Her father owned a saloon near City Hall. Slide pianist Willie the Lion Smith, who lived on Academy Street, recalled how he was caught red-handed stealing from a cash register for a ticket to Blaney's when S.H. Dudley's African-American troupe was appearing there. Broadway producer Jed Harris was introduced to theater growing up in Newark. At the age of 4, he accompanied his parents to the Columbia Theater, where shows were sometimes performed in Yiddish. He was unaware that the people on the stage were actors and understood little of the dialogue until an actor cried out, "I will murder my children." Harris's screams interrupted the performance. For me, he explained, theater was a place where mothers slaughtered their children. For 30 years, Miners Newark Theater was the city's premier showplace, and yet it struggled to gain an audience. During its initial season, Sarah Bernhardt canceled the performance, saying she would not submit to such a gross insult as to appear before such a meager audience. But it soon found its footing as the leading theater in the city, presenting the very finest class of attractions, as they had said. The theatrical season in Newark ran from September to May and featured both dramatic and musical productions. Broadway producers David Belasco, Charles Frohman, and Florence Ziegfeld brought shows to Newark, and acclaimed actors such as Lillian Russell, John Barrymore, and Lily Langtry appeared on its stage. Notable performances included Richard Mansfield in Cyrano de Bergerac, William Farnham in Ben-Hur, Robert Mantell in King Lear, and Maud Adams in Peter Pan. The breadth of performances was impressive. Robert Lorraine in Shaw's Man and Superman, George M. Cohen singing Yankee Doodle Boy and Little Johnny Jones, Leslie Carter in Heart of Maryland performing in a wig with 6 foot long tresses. In the climactic scene, she swung from a belfry 35 feet above the stage. The Wizard of Oz delighted Newark playgoers when it was performed here in 1904. The Evening News wrote, "Curiosity is piqued by the representation of the tornado that sweeps a farmhouse, little Dorothy Gale and her pet cow Imogene, through indefinite space into the country of munchkins, where she meets a tin woodsman without a heart, a scarecrow without brains, a lady lunatic, and other eccentrics. The semblance of the tornado, with its rapidly scudding clouds and baleful gleams of light created by a skillful use of a stereopticon, was very suggestive of nature in an angry mood." During a break in the show's tour, the scarecrow, Fred Stone, returned to Newark and married Elaine Carter, who played the part of Cynthia Cinch, the Lady Lunatic. The ceremony was kept secret, depriving newspapers of headlines that would surely have read, "Scarecrow weds Lady Lunatic in Newark." In 1906, the Newark Theater faced its first serious challenge when the Schubert brothers began staging shows at the Empire Theater. The Schuberts presented Broadway productions, including David Belasco's Girl of the Golden West and The Music Master with David Warfield, as well as vaudeville. Sarah Bernhardt gave a memorable performance there in 1906 before one of the largest audiences ever assembled at a Newark theater, a far cry from the reception she received years earlier. But after just 2 seasons, the Empire changed hands once more and reopened under the management of Edwin Miner, who dubbed it the New House of Burlesque, leaving the Newark Theater as the uncontested home of legitimate theater in the city once more. Newark's show places appealed to diverse tastes. At Waldman's Opera House, the acts included the Monte Carlo Girls Revue with W.C. Fields and the College Girls, in which 18-year-old Fanny Bryce sang Sadie Salome, Go Home. Top vaudeville performers, including Weber and Fields, Irene Franklin, and Eva Puck, played at Proctor's. Fred Astaire was 8 years old when he appeared there in 1907 with his sister Adele. They performed the Wedding Cake Act, posing as bride and groom atop a wedding cake rigged with musical bells and flashing electric lights. Adele wore a satin dress. Fred was in top hat and tails. They tap danced down musical stairs to the Tomb of Dreamland waltz, then exited to change costumes for a closing duet. Adele was dressed as a champagne glass, Fred as a lobster. Reviews with all-black casts, including the Smart Set's Southern Enchantment and Sons of Ham with Burt Williams and George Walker, were staged at the Columbia and the Empire theaters. Burt Williams was one of vaudeville's great tragic comic figures. When Sons of Ham played in Newark, the Evening News called it a musical farce with real colored people in the fore. Williams sings the fortune-telling man to great applause, and Walker, resplendent in evening clothes, leads a song and dance called the Blackville Strutters. This was a period of transformation in African-American theater from minstrel shows that perpetuated stereotypes to productions more accurately depicting the lives of African-Americans on their own terms. This was a slow and incremental process. With all-black reviews such as Sam Jack's Creole Show and Isham's Octoroons playing at the Grand Opera House and Waldman's Opera House. The Creole Show was described as the first Black burlesque show. An important figure in African-American stagecraft was Cicerietta Jones, who performed as Black Patty. This comes from the fact that she was an opera singer who basically couldn't really sing opera and took her name from Adelina Petty, who was a white opera singer. So she became the Black Patty. In 1897, the Black Patty Troubadours with Bob Cole played at Jacobs Theater, performing vaudeville routines, comic skits, and operatic arias. That same year, a trip to Coontown, composed by Cole, opened at the Columbia Theater in Newark. It has been called the first full-length musical production produced and performed by African Americans. In 1902, Southern Enchantment was staged at the Empire's Theater. Written by Ernest Hogan, a popular but controversial performer and composer, it was hailed by Sylvester Russell, the dean of Black entertainment critics. Russell was born in East Orange and grew up in Newark. Writing in the Freeman, he declared, "The unexpected has happened, the event of a new darky sensation, the likes of which our eyes have never seen before. It's the real thing. It's the smartest colored comedy ever produced in America." Between 1908 and 1915, Newark underwent a wave of theater building. More than a dozen theaters were erected, including Keeney's Theater on Branford Place, the Orpheum on Washington Street, the Sam Schubert Theater and Symphony Hall on Broad Street, and Lowe's Majestic on Springfield Avenue. Among them were the first houses built exclusively for motion pictures, the Strand on Market and the Goodwin on Broad. Some older theaters were torn down, including Blaney's and the Empire Theater, which was replaced by Miner's second Empire Theater on Washington Street. The burlesque situation in Newark is very good due to the better grade of production playing at the Empire, Billboard magazine reports. The theater owner with the greatest success in Newark was F.F. Proctor. Proctor's Park Palace Theater continued drawing crowds, and in 1909, he announced plans for a new showplace on Market Street. When construction was delayed, Proctor added an open-air theater called the Bijou Park, and he also acquired the Lyric Theater. Proctor's theaters presented top-line acts. When Fanny Brice headlined at the Park Place Theater in 1912, the Evening News called her an eccentric comedian whose mimetic ability in travestying Hebraic mannerisms puts her in a class by herself. Mae West was 20 when she appeared there in 1913. A critic called her a whirlwind comedian with a pleasing personality, and when she sings, it's all over, she wins. Emerging stars of vaudeville appeared at Proctor's Lyric Theater. Sophie Tucker became a headliner after appearing there in 1909, sorry. Oh, great, there's a page. All right, we're just going to skip over that part. Oh, no, here we go. Okay. So emerging stars of vaudeville appeared at Proctor's Lyric Theater. Sophie Tucker became a headliner after appearing there in 1909. The Marx Brothers performed their first full-length comic skit at the Lyric in 1912, in which Groucho played Herr Professor in a frock coat and spoke with a heavy German accent. Harpo spoke and acted the part of the Patsy Boy in a bright red wig. The Patsy Boy, wrote Variety, is a natural-born comedian. Also, he's a harpist and a good one. In 1915, Newark's Four Corners was the busiest intersection in America. In addition to theaters, there were 110 dining establishments and over 100 cafes and saloons within walking distance of Broad and Market. Places of amusement included music halls, rathskellers, penny arcades, dance dives, and billiard parlors. Theaters had both matinee and evening shows. There was a steady stream of patrons for restaurants and cafes. Newark was a wide open town in those days, recalled Newark guitarist and vocalist Nick Lucas, who is best known for Tiptoes Through the Tulips, who performed at Johnson's Cafe on Plain Street. They had nightclubs all over and everything went. Venues like Johnson's, Nankin Garden, and the Iroquois Club vied with night spots like the Hotel Broad and the Hotel Navarre, where cabaret was featured. After a show, patrons could dine at Kaiser's Rathskeller, where a 12-course meal and a pint bottle of wine cost 50 cents, or sample the pig knuckles and lockwurst at Iflin's and stop for a nightcap at Murray's or the Owl Cafe. Some of the first cafes catering to African Americans were on Arlington Street, between Branford Place and Augusta Street on Newark's Barbary Coast. It's the site of Kinney Hall and Randolph's Cafe, where the slide pianist Willie the Lion Smith and James P. Johnson performed. Smith recalled, as you walked around the coast, you could always hear the tinkling of the pianos behind the swinging doors and the banging shutters of those houses they called buffet flats, or just plain cat houses. There was action and music at any time of day or night. When Proctor's Palace opened in 1915, it was dubbed Newark's grandest amusement temple. It was a double-decker, 2 theaters housed in an 8-story building. The ground floor Palace Theater seated 2,800. The roof theater could accommodate 1,400. The Palace became the city's preeminent vaudeville house. But vaudeville faced competition for motion pictures, and some theaters were converted into movie houses. Even the Newark Theater had trouble competing. It had long been the city's most prestigious venue, but had to contend with the Sam Schubert Theater. And in 1916, it switched to motion pictures, eventually becoming the Paramount Theater. There followed a second wave of theater building from 1920 to 1925. New show places include the Rialto and Lowe's State on Broad Street and the Branford Theater on Branford Place. By 1922, there were 17 major theaters within a quarter-mile radius of the Four Corners, including 2 legitimate theaters, 5 vaudeville theaters, 2 burlesque houses, and 8 motion pictures theaters with an aggregate capacity of 30,000. The wave of theater building concluded in 1925 with the completion of the Salam Temple, the Mosque Theater, the city's largest and most opulent show place with a seating capacity of 3,400. Newark theaters prospered by combining movies and live acts, and some performers were especially adept at drawing crowds. Harry Houdini promoted his appearances with outlandish skits. In 1908, he dove manacled into the Passaic River. In 1922, he escaped from a straitjacket suspended over Market Street. The Evening News described him dangling from a beam thrust out a 6-story window, his feet bound by strips of canvas. 2 freight handlers hauled him up until the wizard was suspended over the crowd. He wriggled around, turned red in the face, and presto, he was free.
Newark theaters were a proving ground for acts that became headliners. George Burns and Gracie Allens performed together for the first time at the Hill Theater on Springfield Avenue in 1923. We were booked in Newark at $5 a day, Burns recalled. It wasn't much, but they did guarantee us 3 days. Burns delivered the comic lines, but the audience loved Gracie. I didn't have to be a genius to understand there was something wrong when the straight lines got more laughs than the punchlines. Burns explained. Between shows, he rewrote the act. That evening, Jack Benny joined them for dinner. Benny had recently appeared at Proctor's Palace, where he received only passing notice. The news report reported he tells some original stories and fiddles a bit. The biggest stars of vaudeville played at the Palace, including Eva Tanguay. Tanguay was vaudeville's highest paid act, and her performances were described as cyclonic. Tanguay wore outlandish costumes and gyrated across the stage, performing songs like I Don't Care and It's All Been Done Before, but Not the Way I Do It. A critic said Tanguay solved the mystery of perpetual motion and proves it by sundry jerks and tosses and whirls and giggles, prancing wildly across the stage with the sole intention of prancing wildly back again. Tanguay lived in Newark for 2 years before debuting on Broadway. During a week-long engagement at Proctor's in 1917, she drew 40,000 patrons. When the Marx Brothers played the Palace in 1917, 6 years had elapsed since their debut performance at the Lyric. In Home Again, their stage personas were on full display. The piece abounds in comic surprises, witty conversations, and ludicrous pantomime, wrote the Evening News. Julius Marx offers the most in dialogue fun. Arthur Marx plays harp and achieves the most amusing effects in pantomime, and Leonard Marx, as an Italian, is entertaining in both characterization and as a pianist. Babe Ruth performed the vaudeville routine at Proctor's in 1921. The act included a mind-reading routine and comic patter. After the performance, Ruth visited a boys' club on Broad Street. As Ruth was leaving, the kids called out, "Babe, tell us how to make a home run." He stopped, grinned, closed his eyes, and said, "Just close your eyes and swing. Close your eyes and swing." It's there. Milton Berle recalled meeting Cary Grant for the first time at Proctor's in 1925. Grant, still Archie Leach, performed an acrobatic routine, and Berle, in need of a straight man, enlisted Grant. Berle describes the encounter. He was with a group that opened the vaudeville show. He was the stilt walker, and I was doing a single act. We played the stage show and the second show up on the roof garden. I remember they had a lot of trouble getting the stilts upstairs. When U.B. Blake and Noble Sissel played at the Proctors in 1919, a booking agent wanted them to perform in blackface. Some agent had a smart idea for an act for us, Blake explains. We were supposed to shuffle on stage in blackface and patched up overalls. In the middle of the stage, there is a big box with a piano in it. The idea was to look at it as if we were from the moon, and I'd say, "What's that?" And Noble would say, "That's a piano," and then we'd do our act. Instead, they performed in tuxedos. 2 years later, Sissel and Blake's Shuffle Along opened in New York and became a theatrical landmark. While it was still running on Broadway, they formed a touring company which played at the Orpheum in Newark with a cast that included 15-year-old Josephine Baker. African-American performers such as Ernest Hogan, Walker and Williams, and Bob Cole played to packed audiences at the Columbia Theater, Proctor's Park, and Orpheum, and yet colored theatergoers were relegated to the balcony at the Schubert and Palace. In 1925, Black actor Lee Whipper became manager of the Orpheum. It is said to be the only colored theater in New Jersey, Variety reported. The entire staff, musicians, and all will be colored. The Orpheum was a popular venue for Black audiences. Performers who played there included Ethel Waters, Bill Bojangle Robinson, Adelaide Hall, and Duke Ellington. Bessie Smith performed at the Orpheum on several occasions. A 1925 concert was the subject of a Vanity Fair article by Carl Van Vechten. "Going to hear Bessie Smith's act?" a cab driver asked Van Vechten on the way to the theater. "You can't get in. They've been hanging on the chandeliers all week." Van Vechten describes Smith sauntering onto the stage, quote, "in a rose dress spangled with sequins, Her voice, full of shouting and moaning and praying and suffering, a wild, rough Ethiopian voice, harsh and volcanic, released between rouged lips and the whitest of teeth. In 1929, Smith gave an impromptu concert at the Broad and Market music shop where, quote, crowds jostled, straining to hear the blues notes as rendered by Miss Smith and her jazz boys. From its earliest days, vaudeville houses incorporated rag and syncopated music and jazz combos, though they were initially billed as novelty acts. One of the first New Orleans jazz groups, the Creole Orchestra, performed at the Lyric Theater in 1916. Other jazz innovators followed, including Clarence Williams' 10 Kings of Jazz with Fats Waller, Sidney Bechet, who toured with the 7-Eleven Review, and King Oliver and the Syncopators, excuse me. When the self-styled King of Jazz, Paul Whiteman, performed at the Moss Theater in 1928, his orchestra included some of the finest white jazz musicians, including Bix Beiderbecke and Frank Tombauer, along with Bing Crosby and the Rhythm Boys. Through it all, burlesque remained popular at the Empire Theater. Before becoming a star, Eddie Cantor performed on amateur nights at the Empire. Before teaming with Lou Costello, Bud Abbott produced stock comedy shows there. Rose Lee was a 20-year-old when Bill Minsky discovered her performing at the Empire in 1931 and gave her top billing at Minsky's Theater in New York. She became Gypsy Rose Lee. Other Newark theaters evolved over time. The Little Theater is remembered for presenting X-rated films. When it opened in 1930, it was the venue for the Motion Picture Guild of Newark, dedicated to preserving silent film classics. It then became an art house showing films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Battleship Potemkin. In 1936, it presented Ecstasy, which had an extended run of 16 consecutive weeks. An advertisement at the theater read, 150,000 Newarkers can't be wrong. All right, so I'll give you a rest from me. This should be working, but it's not. All right. No, it's not. Sorry for the interruptions. All right. I wanted to give you a breather from listening to me. We can't do that. I'll just have to. Yeah. And you're thinking that it will work now? No, still not. All right, if you go back to the second one, and I'll tell you on this. Now you're going in the other. It should be going in the other direction. Well, anyway, that's.
Right. Right. So this is a photograph of Ethel Barrymore. Morris Schlesinger had the two most important theaters in Newark during this period. Okay, and the lobby of his Broad Street Theater was lined with photographs, most of them autographed by people who performed there. This is Helen Hayes at the age of 23. Well, let's just do this part. So when you go, will this take? Right. So this is Waldman's Theater, which was on the corner of Market Street and Halsey Street. This was the oldest theater in Newark. It was originated in the civil period just before the Civil War. It was originally a concert hall, but they found that people were less interested in concerts than minstrel shows and other things of that nature. So it eventually became Waldman's Theater, and it became one of the most important vaudeville houses in the city. Next one. This is the Newark Theater, Miners Newark Theater on Market Street, which was the first real organized theater in the city, built specifically for theater productions. This eventually became what many of you would know as the Paramount Theater on Market Street. Next. This is Proctor's Park Place Theater. It was Proctor's first theater in Newark. It was the one that I was talking about earlier, where people like Chaplin performed. One of the early vaudeville houses. And the next. This is the first Empire Theater. This was on Washington Street, and it was torn down in 1911 to make room for Bamberger's department store. Next. This is the Washington Theater on Washington Street. Originally, this was also a concert hall. And it went through many iterations, all kinds of programs there, but it became most famous as Blaney's Theater, which was the one that we were talking about before with Fanny Brice. Next. This is the new Miners Theater. When the first Miners Theater was torn down, this opened on Washington just below Market Street. And this became the burlesque house in Newark for four decades. This is at the Lyric Theater, which was a vaudeville house not far from the Newark Theater. It was on Market Street, just below Beaver. I'll go back to the one. Can you go just one back? No, now we're going forward again. All right, just leave it like that. So there was a picture that just flashed by, and it's a venue called the Comedy Theater. One of the reasons that was significant is that somewhere between 1905 and 1910, Adolf Zucker had an idea that American audiences, who were basically going to like short shows that really didn't have any plot line, would be interested in longer movies. And he had recently been in Europe and seen a play of the Passion, a movie of the Passion Play. And he thought the New York audiences will go for this. But as he pointed out, he would never have tried it out at a New York theater because it might not work out. But he would try it out at his Newark theater, where if it flopped, the New York folks wouldn't know anything about it. So he acquired the film. It was the first three-reel film, the first long film ever shown in the United States.
Just to make sure it worked out well, put in the first organ in an American theater, and the audiences loved it, and it was a big success. It confirmed Zucker's belief that the American audiences were ready for that sort of thing. And basically, that's how Paramount Pictures came into being, the success of Zucker's film at this theater. All right, so this is a program of the Newark Theater in 1911, 1910, 1911. There are some others that are just absolutely gorgeous. Next one. This is the from Proctor's Theater, which would, again, the very early vaudeville house. Next, please. This is a handbill for Eva Tangay's performance in The Follies of 1909. This was a very early version of the Ziegfeld Follies. Next one, please. This is a program for the Sam Schubert Theater, and they were competitors with the Newark Theater. And then eventually this theater became the Broad Street Theater. But I'm drawing attention to the advertisement sort of in the back there for the Washington Restaurant. Washington Restaurant is one of the few buildings from that era that still stands. It's right at the corner of Washington Place and Broad Street. And around 1914, they had a New Year's Eve event there, a dance and on entertainment. And James Reese Europe's Society Orchestra, which is a very important orchestra during that early period, probably the first to ever record what might be considered jazz music. But also on the program were two sisters, Mildred and her sister Mae West was also on the bill that night. Next, please. The Dolly sisters were a very important, very popular duo in that period. They were identical twins from Hungary. Next. That's, I think, speaks for itself. Intolerance at the Strand Theater in 1917. Next, please. That's the program for the Proctor's Palace Theater. Next. This is, unfortunately, these have gotten mixed up in this, the way they're being projected now. But anyway, this is Irving Berlin's Music Box Review at the Schubert Theater. It's the playbill for that. Next, please. This is a promotional thing for the Marx Brothers and Animal Crackers at the Schubert Theater. It actually is a 4-piece fold out on like a cardboard stock. Next, please. And this is Playgoer, which was a program for the combined theaters, the Broad and Schubert theaters, both of Morris Schlesinger's theaters. Next. So we saw this before. These are the three Keatons, and the far left, that's Buster Keaton shortly after he joined his parents in the act. His father basically used to roll him up and throw him around. He once I think they were heckled by an audience at one time, and he did that, rolled them up and he threw it at the guy, threw Buster at the guy. Next. Thank you. That's Fred Astaire at the age of 8, around the time when the two of them appeared at the Proctor's Theater to do the wedding cake dance. Next. And that's the original, from the original stage production of The Wizard of Oz. And that's Fred Stone, obviously, who performed the part of the Scarecrow. Next, please. All right, so this is Williams and Walker, very, very important early comedy duo. And as you can see in the picture, they're both playing different kinds of African-American stereotypes. And so the stereotype that Burt Williams is playing is in blackface. Again, the terminology is complicated, but they build themselves as two real coons. And the reason for this is because Black people were portrayed by white people in blackface. And a way in which Black performers undermined that was to basically say, no, they're fake. We're the real thing. And by putting on blackface, it actually helped them undermine the notion of that Black caricature. This is Eva Tangay, who I told you about a little bit. This is one of her less flashy costumes. Next, please. And this is Fanny Bryce, looking not as we sort of know her in doing her comedy routine. Very, very early picture of her. Next, please. All right, this is Eddie Cantor. originally I was thinking that I would not include this, but the reason I did is that Eddie Cantor was a young up and coming comedian when he teamed up with Burt Williams in the Ziegfeld Follies. Burt Williams played in blackface. Eddie Cantor played in blackface as Burt Williams' son. Now, to me, partly what's significant about that is white audiences seeing this routine know that Burt Williams is black and that Eddie Cantor is white. But the dominant figure in the production is is Burt Williams, the black man. So audiences seeing that are seeing something they don't normally see, and certainly not on stage, an African-American person in a dominant position. So it's these kinds of strategies that are happening during this period that sort of change somewhat the racial dynamics. Slow and incremental, as I said before. Next, please. All right. The second from the right is Josephine Baker. She's about 15 when this picture was taken, and then she auditioned for Shuffle Along, Blake and Sissel's Shuffle Along. She was too young to be allowed to perform on stage in New York and was brokenhearted by the rejection. But in fact, at the time, she thought that she was rejected because she was a more dark-skinned than the lighter-skinned chorus girls that she assumed that they were looking for. Now, Sissel and Blake knew the real reason, but she didn't know that. But then when the show became a hit on Broadway, she re-auditioned. They brought her in immediately because those age restrictions didn't apply outside of Broadway. The one in the middle is Jimmy Durante with the two guys that he was in an act with for many years. And this is around the time he appeared at Proctor's on Market Street. Next, please. All right, and the last two we talked about before, this is Ethel Barrymore, the other one. Yep. And this is Helen Hayes at, I guess, about 23 or something, one of her early roles in New York. And next, please. All right, and so this is one of the programs for the Broad and Schubert Theater, which was Morris Schlesinger's theaters, which I'm going to talk about now. That makes kind of like a, and you can just leave that one up. I'm looking at them and listening to me. Newark was part of the subway circuit, theaters in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and North Jersey that could be reached by subway or the tubes. The circuit included the Broad and Schubert theaters, where new productions were tried out before opening on Broadway, and tours of successful shows were launched. Both were managed by Morris Schlesinger, who leased the Broad Street Theater in 1916. For the next 7 years, it was the city's premier venue. In 1923, Schlesinger acquired the Schubert Theater on Branford Place, and thereafter the Broad and Schubert presented shows as part of a combined program. The Schubert offered musicals, the Broad staged dramas and comedies. Shows ran for 1 week, and Schlesinger booked dozens of shows every season. Over the next 10 years, his theaters staged over 600 Broadway productions. In 1925, the Evening News reported that 34 of the 37 musical productions presented in or sent out from Manhattan were presented at the Schubert Theater that year. Florence Ziegfeld and George White brought shows to Newark prior to the New York runs. Musicals by Jerome Kern and George Gershwin were heard there before debuting on Broadway, as well as works by Eugene O'Neill and Noel Coward. The Broad saw performances by Broadway's finest actors, Ethel Barrymore appearing in The Laughing Lady and The Second Mrs. Tangri. Noel Coward was 24 when Easy Virtue had its debut performance at the Broad. Helen Hayes first appeared there in To the Ladies in 1923, and Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontaine performed at both the Broad and the Schubert Theater. Before becoming headliners, Claudette Colbert and Barbara Stanwyck appeared at the Broad Street Theater. Betty Davis first appeared there in Wild Duck in 1929 when she was 21. A difficult role is that of Hedwig, the sensitive 14-year-old, wrote the Evening News, but the slender, girlish Miss Davis finds means to make her portraiture one of the more elusive and gripping in the production. One of Spencer Tracy's first roles was in George M. Cohan's Whispering Friends at the Broad in 1928. Paul Muni and Humphrey Bogart appeared there multiple times. In 1932, Humphrey Bogart played the Schubert and the Broad within a space of 6 weeks. The Broad staged box office hits like Rain with Jeannie Eagles, The Butter and Egg Man with George Kelly, and Abbey's Irish Rose. But there are also dramatic works by international artists, including the Moscow Art Theater, Max Reinhardt's Berlin Theater Company, and the Abbey Theater Players from Dublin. Productions by the New York Theater Guild were also staged there with works by Eugene O'Neill, including Strange Interlude in Morning Becomes Electra, George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan, and the Guild's production of Porgy with an all-black cast. Several plays at the Broad were produced by Jed Harris, who grew up in Newark and became a theatrical wonderkin at the age of 26. His shows included Coquette with Helen Hayes, The Royal Family, and The Front Page. Jed Harris has done it again, the Evening News wrote when reviewing The Front Page, and right here in his hometown. Schlesinger's Schubert Theater was bigger than the Broad, ideal for musical productions with elaborate sets, and he kept the ticket prices low. The Schubert's appeal was obvious. Why should playgoers drive to New York and pay more when they could see the same theatrical productions and cast in Newark at a reduced price? Schlesinger was active when the Broadway musical evolved into a new form of stagecraft. Newark playgoers witnessed this transformation in real time. Arthur Hammerstein and Florence Ziegfeld brought hit shows to the Schubert. Some of the first musicals by Oscar Hammerstein, George Gershwin, and Rodgers and Hart, as well as operettas by Sigmund Romberg, were staged there. Romberg's student Prince previewed in Newark before becoming one of Broadway's longest-running shows. Some shows were vehicles for established stars. Others introduced new ones. Some actors who became stars began their careers in the chorus in Broadway musicals. Joan Crawford was a chorus girl in Innocent Eyes, which played at the Schubert in 1924. James Cagney danced in Pitter Patter at the Broad in 1921. Ruby Keeler first appeared at the Broad in 1926 at the age of 17 in a musical called Bye Bye Bonnie. When she returned in Sidewalks of New York, the Evening News took note of the winsome Ruby Keeler with legs as shapely as Miskenget. Al Jolson was the most popular entertainer in America when Sinbad played at the Broad in 1920. In 1923, he appeared in Bombo at the Schubert Theater, performing April Showers and Toot Toot Tootsie Goodbye. Newark playgoers watched Fred Astaire evolve from a child performer, partnering with his sister through his early successes on Broadway. In 1925, they were billed as juvenile stars in an artistic singing and dancing specialty. They shared top billing in 1925 in Gershwin's Lady Be Good, in which Fred sang Fascinating Rhythm. A more graceful, faster, and neater stepper than Fred Astaire would be hard to find, the Evening News wrote. Ed Wynn and W.C. Fields became headliners in shows built around characters they embodied on stage. Wynn delighted audiences in The Perfect Fool and The Laugh Parade. Fields' bumptious character was first introduced in Poppy, which previewed at the Schubert in 1923. Fields, as Professor Eustace McGargle, stole the show. Jeanette MacDonald appeared in several shows at the Schubert, including Boom Boom in 1929, opposite Cary Grant, still named Archie Leach. Grant had graduated from stilt walking to small parts in musicals and sang a duet with MacDonald, who recalled, "He was absolutely terrible, but everybody liked him." The following year, Grant returned to the Schubert Theater in A Wonderful Night. When it opened, Mae West was appearing in Diamond Lil at the Broad. Archie Leach was a relatively unknown actor, so it's unlikely they met. But 3 years later, Diamond Lil became She Done Him Wrong, in which Mae West's Lady Lou famously tells Captain Cummings, Cary Grant, "Why don't you come up and see me?" When Jimmy Durante joined the cast of Strike Me Pink at the Schubert in 1933, the show had just been rewritten. He was studying the script when a reporter appeared. "It's pandemonium," cried Durante. "Here I am in the midst of a show, and I still don't know what it's all about. It's degenerating." When the reporter persisted, Durante responded, "It's pandemonium, I tell you. I'm mortified beyond construction." Eddie Cantor scored the Schubert's biggest box office hit with Whoopi in 1928. Cantor was a favorite with Newark audiences in shows that included Make It Snappy, in which he sang Yes, We Have No Bananas, and Kid Boot, and as a headliner in the Ziegfeld Follies. In 1927, Broadway underwent a seismic shift when Ziegfeld joined forces with Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein to create Showboat. After a long run on Broadway, it launched its national tour in Newark on September 23rd, 1929, exactly 95 years ago this week. In addition to musicals, the Schubert stage reviews with elaborate sets, scantily clad chorus girls, and precision choreography. The most extravagant were the Ziegfeld Follies staged at the Schubert beginning in 1924. Ziegfeld's main competitor was George White, and 6 installments of George White's Scandals were performed in Newark between 1922 and 1935. Several editions of Earl Carroll's Vanities were presented at the Schubert, including the 1932 edition, which introduced the jazz standard, I've Got a Right to Sing the Blues. Lou Leslie's reviews featured both white and African-American performers. However, Leslie was best known for shows with all-black casts, beginning with the Blackbirds of 1928. Ethel Waters headlined Blackbirds of 1930, performing Memories of You by U.B. Blake, who conducted the orchestra. Other productions with all-black casts included Runnin' Wild, which introduced the Charleston, composed by James P. Johnson, Cecil and Blake's Chocolate Dandies with Josephine Baker, and Connie's Hot Chocolate Review, which debuted Fats Waller's Ain't Misbehavin' and Why Do I Have to Be So Black and Blue. Shows at the Schubert included songs by composers and lyricists whose works comprise the Great American Songbook. Some were heard for the first time when shows previewed in Newark. Others became hits on Broadway and were performed in Newark for Newark audiences at the start of the show's national tour. Irving Berlin introduced All Alone and What'll I Do in his music box reviews at the Schubert. 7 Gershwin musicals were performed there, including Lady Be Good and OK, which introduced Someone to Watch Over Me. Cole Porter debuted Love for Sale in the New Yorkers at the Schubert Theater, and Let's Do It, Let's Fall in Love in Paris heard at the Broad. 7 Rodgers and Hart's musicals were staged at Schlesinger theaters between 1926 and 1931, including She's My Baby and A Connecticut Yankee. Oscar Hammerstein wrote lyrics for 5 shows staged at the Schubert, including The New Moon, which introduced Lover Come Back to Me. In 1927, Hammerstein teamed with Jerome Kern to create Showboat, which included Old Man River and Can't Help Loving That Man of Mine. Kern was a student at Barringer High School when he had his first musical success at the Newark Theater. Kern composed music for numerous shows at the Schubert and Broad, including Sweet Adeline and The Cat and the Fiddle. Kern compositions included Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, A Fine Romance, and The Way You Look Tonight. Ted Koehler, though less celebrated than Kern, made significant contributions to the American Songbook. Koehler learned to play the piano as a young man growing up in Newark. He began his career accompanying silent films at the Seashell Theater on Market Street before teaming with Harold Arlen. Koehler wrote the lyrics for Stormy Weather, Get Happy, I've Got the World on a String, and I've Got a Right to Sing the Blues. Morris Schlesinger's theaters served as a gatekeeper to Broadway, the last stop on the way to the Manhattan. Newark playgoers had the final say on whether a show would open or fold before reaching the Great Wide Way. Producers sometimes hired a show doctor to polish a production. When Pleasure Brown tried out at Newark in 1929, the Schubert brothers enlisted Busby Berkeley. Some shows received a complete makeover. The Ziegfeld Follies of 1934 was in shambles when it reached Newark, where it was, quote, revamped, redesigned, rewritten, and in part recast, according to composer Vernon Duke. It was fascinating to watch a dancing phoenix emerge from the ashes, he wrote. When the show opened in New York, it was a hit. George White's Scandals of 1931 flopped in Atlantic City and was resurrected in Newark when the producer added 23-year-old Ethel Merman. Her performance of Life is Just a Bowl of Cherries was a showstopper. A critic wrote, Ethel Merman has been called on to croon things in her own lusty way, whereby she seems to take all of Newark and Nebraska into her confidence in one fell whoop. The show introduced That's Why Darkies Were Born, performed in blackface by baritone Everett Marshall in a production number that included 35 white chorus girls dressed as angels. The New York Times called it a Negro fantasy. The show was a hit on Broadway. And just as an aside, Kate Smith immediately did a recording of the song and it became a hit. But immediately after that, Paul Robeson made a recording of it. And the final lines in the final stanza, someone's got to fight the devil, someone's got to shout Gabriel's horn, sung by Robeson, gave a totally different sense of the song. Bob Hope first appeared on Broadway in Ups-a-Daisy, which previewed at the Shubert in 1928. He was back 4 years later in Ballyhoo of 1932. The show was a work in progress when it reached Newark. Hope recalled, "The Newark curtain was laid. The girls were still running around in circles and little else, and Lee Shubert said, 'Go out there and ad lib.' So I ran out and said, 'Ladies and gentlemen, this is the first time I've ever been on before the acrobats, but we're doing a new number tonight and we had a late rehearsal. It was a stage-wise audience. They knew I was ad libbing. I stayed out there for about 6 minutes. Afterwards, Lee Shubert said to the production staff, 'Why don't you have Hope open the show that way after every performance?' Hope's routine was added to the show. Indeed, Bob Hope seems to have invented his comic persona on the stage of the Shubert Theater that evening. By 1928, the number of Broadway musicals had decreased due to mounting costs and the popularity of movies. Still, Morris Schlesinger was able to bring 79 productions to the Broad and Shubert theaters. But the Great Depression that began in 1929 sent shockwaves through the theater industry. After a steep increase in the cost of shipping sets, producers cut Newark from their tours. This made it difficult for Schlesinger to book shows. The musical show field is at its lowest ebb in years, Schlesinger remarked shortly after announcing in 1932 that the Shubert would no longer present Broadway shows. With Newark mired in the Depression, he cut tickets at the prices at the Broad, but to no avail. In 1933, he declined to renew the lease. Writing in the Sunday Call, theater critic Edward Southern Hip reported, M.S. Schlesinger has delivered his valedictory at Newark's Impresario of Legitimate Theater. For 18 years, Mr. Schlesinger held forth at the Broad Street Theater. For the last decade, he had the Shubert, the town's home for musicals, and a mighty prosperous home it was when money was loose and Ziegfeld, Carroll, and White were at their best. Now the Broad Street Theater is in the hands of cinema interests, and the outlook at the Shubert is as dark as the lobby. Schlesinger's departure signaled a decline in Newark's theater row. But as we know, Newark played an outside role shaping American popular culture, especially in radio. WJZ was the country's second commercial station and the first in the New York area. Along with WOR, it was a pioneer in spreading mass culture across the United States. This was possible because of Newark's theaters and the performers who played there. Newark's radio stations brought their voices to a nationwide audience over the airwaves. Beginning in 1921, WJZ broadcast from the Westinghouse factory on Orange Street, and almost everything it aired was a first. Al Jolson's radio debut was on WJZ singing April Showers. Eddie Cantor stopped by after performing at the Rialto. And in 1922, Ed Wynn and the cast of The Perfect Fool broadcast the first Broadway show on radio from its studio. When Wynn balked at the absence of an audience, the station manager filled the studio with stagehands, creating the first studio audience. WOR began broadcasting from Bamberger's in 1922. Harry Houdini gave the first radio interview from his studio, and Charlie Chaplin had his first radio debut there in 1923. "My friends," he told the vast unseen audience, "I'm glad you can't see me. I'm as nervous as a witch. This is the first time I've spoken over the radio." Indeed, it was probably the first time his fans heard his voice. Shortly after Chaplin's visit, the Marx Brothers brought their show to WOR for an on-air performance. Exactly 104 years ago today, the Marx Brothers were appearing at Proctor's Theater on Market Street. They were second on the bill. The headliner was an Italian tenor named Guido Ciccolini. They returned in 1927, appearing at the Shubert and Coconuts with Margaret Dumont playing foil to Groucho for the first time, and in 1929 in Animal Crackers, in which Groucho crooned "Hooray for Captain Spaulding." And when Coconuts became a film, they paid homage to those early Newark stations. Groucho. This is a map and a diagram of the whole Coconut section. The whole area is within a radius of 3/4 of a mile. Radius. Is there a remote possibility that you even know what radius means? Chico, it's a WJZ. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think we have a time for a few questions. Is there one from the audience while I check the chat from the Zoom? Mike, you're gonna.
The Four Corners is the intersection of Broad and Market Street. For centuries, it was the very center of downtown Newark. And actually, its historic significance is it's the place where the initial Puritan settlers who arrived in Newark allotted their families' plots. So it's been the center of Newark right from the start.
Michael, William May, whom you know was a photographer in Newark and captured so much of the Newark Public Schools and is giving a significant part of his photographic archive to the Newark Public Library. Writes, this is an incredibly informative presentation, very well researched, a significant revealing of Newark, New Jersey being a hidden gem in American history. Bert Williams was highly intelligent and surely ahead of his time. Anything more you can say about Bert Williams?
I left out the line by W.C. Fields, who said, Bert Williams was the funniest man he ever heard. No, the funniest man he ever saw, and the saddest man he ever met. It was very, very difficult being Bert Williams. His partner, Robert Walker, was more sort of activist oriented. Williams less so. But the significance of Williams is extraordinary because he in some ways, and I may be missing the mark by saying this, but he in some ways, in terms of theater, was akin to Jackie Robinson. In other words, he broke ground. He commanded attention. He was very much respected. But at the same time, white actors actually tried to force the producers to give him less salary because they were outraged that a black man was receiving more than he was. And like Jackie Robinson, he toughed it out, but at an enormous toll. I'll just tell one little anecdote. Eddie Cantor and Bert Williams went into a bar after a show one time, and Bert Williams tried to order a gin. And I'll give a variation on the story, but the bartender said that'll be $20, which was an outrageous amount, and it was just insulting, and it was basically saying, I'm not going to serve a black man. So Bert Williams took out $100 bill and said, I'll have 5.
Are there questions from the audience here?
We're all listened out.
Gail?
You mentioned briefly some of the theaters being segregated, but did you get a sense of how segregated theaters were? I mean, movie theaters were segregated for a long time.
Yeah, in the research that I've done, I didn't find any specific examples where people were told that they couldn't come in or they had to sit someplace or other place, in some kind of segregated seating. So I can't give you specific factual stuff where I found that out, where I was able to determine that.
Michael, we have a question on what is a stereopticon? That I know I have one at home, but I think you mentioned that for the Wizard of
Right.
Oz.
In other words, I'm not quite sure how it would have worked in terms of this particular production, but a stereopticon is you put an image in and it projects it in 3 dimensions. So I imagine they somehow use a device like that to give the illusion of the wind blowing and the structures blowing around. But beyond that, I really I can't say. I could make something up, but I'm
Yeah.
not.
Reggie?
Hey, Michael, how are you?
Hi.
So, you left us all thrilled, but what about the rest of the years? You stayed back like in the 1920s. Are you going to keep going?
No, okay. So this is where I have the most research done. This is the point where most of the live performing houses in Newark cease to be. It continues randomly at a number of theaters over the next couple of years, but it's never anything like it was up to 1933. The next thing that I would be focusing on is the transition in which there were mostly movie theaters. However, this became the big band era. And so when you get into the 30s, late 30s and 40s, you have all kinds of performers playing here at the what then became the Adams Theater, at the Paramount Theater, sometimes at the Branford Theater, and some of the other theaters. I was just reading a review of Josephine Baker at the Branford Theater in 1951. So there's a lot of interesting things there, but it doesn't, really can't compete. Of course, you also had in some of the clubs, you had Jackie Gleason, you had Red Fox and people like that. And a lot of performances by Sinatra very early in his career. So there's a lot more to do, but this is sort of like of an era that was sort of like pretty astonishing.
Michael, I want to ask a question. Your sources, this is very well researched. Where are you finding your information, and are there archives that are particularly rich with the materials?
Well, so first of all, I acknowledge both the Newark Library and the Historical Society, which have extraordinary collections of the various programs and things like that. A lot of it is just aggressively Googling and putting together combinations which might narrow down the place to search for a particular performer at a particular time. So I've spent a lot of time doing that. And then in terms of like some of the performers, I've just randomly like thought, well, everybody else was there. Why not her or him? And so I'll do a search of a biography or an autobiography. And suddenly, like, you're these extraordinary anecdotes. I haven't yet been to the Performing Arts Library in New York, which I plan to do. The Harvard Library apparently has some very, very interesting things. The New York Public Library apparently has the Gypsy Rose Lee collection, which includes the program for the night that Minsky discovered her. So there's things all over the place.
So is there a book on the way?
Pardon?
Is there a book on the way?
Possibly. I mean, it's a lot of work, and the question always becomes whether a publisher, in this case, I would hope we would bring it to Rutgers University Press, but the question is whether they think there's a market for it. And that's really always the question, right? So it's like, do you put in all the effort and not get a book out of it? On the other hand, I think that organizing the stuff in the way that I'm doing it for the book, it still can be packaged in a way in which we could house all that material in a place like the Newark Library, where future researchers have access to it. So that's one of the other things I'm interested in doing.
Michael, we have a question online. You've talked about both white and black performers. Can you talk a little bit more about the audience and whether African Americans were permitted to sit anywhere, or were the audiences segregated? Were the theaters segregated?
Yeah, just in the examples that I've given where other writers have written about the Proctors and the Schubert. I think what we're talking about is more of a sort of like cultural norms where it's sort of unspoken. I'm not sure, for example, I don't think we're talking about the Deep South where if somebody was sitting in the front of the bus, they'd get thrown out. I'm not sure that we're talking about that kind of segregation. But clearly, when Whipper had the opportunity to take over the Orpheum Theater, where it was a theater where African Americans felt like this is for us, of us, and by us, that changes the dynamic. Excuse me. You have to call on.
Oh, how did like, it came in towards the transition, but how does the Newark Symphony Hall play into music, theater, performance?
So there's two symphony halls. There was one I referred to earlier in as Symphony Hall. And that was opened on Broad Street sometime around 1912. And it was short-lived. It didn't work out as an actual concert hall, so it became a movie theater. It became the first Paramount. Mosque Theater opens in 1925, initially as a movie theater with some live performances, and only later becomes a center of music, symphony concerts. It slowly evolved, but it was not built as a classical music theater. It was built as a movie theater.
Michael, Saifa Valencia from online says, what would you say are the main reasons that caused the downfall or made the vaudeville shows less popular?
I think a lot of it obviously had to do with motion pictures, and you get to a point where the big stars of vaudeville have careers either in movies, but a lot of them, Jack Benny and others, Milton Berle, all these people get shows on radio, and they have movie careers. So that takes a lot of the thunder out of it. And then essentially, particularly as you go through the Depression, right? Everything is more expensive if it's live. I mean, you can sort of, you particularly see this in terms of musicals, right? The cost of musicals was exceptional. The cost of transporting them was exceptional. However, if you brought the cast out to Hollywood and you shot it once, you could have it in 100 theaters and you don't have to troop the actors around and the sets around. So the evolution from Broadway musicals as being the venue or being the form to MGM and all the rest of that stuff, it's just sort of the same process, and everything just goes into hyperdrive during the Depression. I mean, everything came together at that point.
We'll have a final question here.
The question. Mike, I'm just curious. I was looking at the map and I'm looking at where all these structures were. I'm wondering how many of those structures are really still standing?
Several of them are, but they have been like ghost theaters, some of them since the late 70s or 1980s. Lowe's was turned down. I think they've just gutted the Paramount. But there were a few that still stand. I'm personally most interested in the old Adams Theater because that had a life both as a movie theater, as a venue for the big bands, and then all of the stuff that I just discussed in terms of that life. I don't know whether that's gutted on the inside or not. Branford Place. The Branford Theater and the Adams Theater are sort of diagonally opposite each other on Branford Place.
Well, okay,
Yeah, we're good.
Well, there's certain, would you happen to know the names of the architectural firms or the architects? Back in the day, there were famous architects.
Yes,
Like, I
there,
was just wondering. were
there
certain
is a
ones-
book, there's not a book, but there's a collection of architectural drawings of several of these theaters. And you can actually access that online. But several of the theaters were done by very significant designers of theaters. The Strand, which was designed as a movie theater, but then quickly kind of like became a hybrid of vaudeville and movies, has been described as like one of the really early gems of what we think of as a movie palace. It wasn't as big as some of the ones in New York, but there was a kind of like formula in which they built something on the stage, right? That created in effect like a window around the film, and then the film was projected into the window. But so, like I said, surprisingly, it then almost immediately became a mixed use thing, bringing in vaudeville.
because they were trying their owners were trying to figure out what combination would work. So you had all of these things changes. I'm not sure of the name of the site that would have it, but there's definitely like there are not architectural, but sketches of the fronts of these theaters with the details about, if you they're in there. Right. Right. So I have a website. If you go to my website and email me with your email, I'll track down what that is and I'll send that to you, because it identifies all the architects.
Yeah, just if you Google Michael Immerso, you can find his personal, and it's IMMERSO. Michael Immerso. I think another round of applause is really merited. This is terrific. Thank you. Just a terrific presentation and so much information that I think is new to most of us and brought together really well. Our next program is November 12th. It's about Peter Rodino, Larry Spinelli, who was his chief of staff during the Watergate hearings and has written a new biography, a Belleville native, will be here to talk about how Peter Rodino made it from Newark to Capitol Hill in the Watergate hearings, November 12th. Thank you for coming and good night.